corporate management thought they had committed the perfect crime. The facility director was stealing liquid morphine from dying veterans, replacing it with salt water, and wiping the digital servers to cover his tracks. He assumed the night shift was completely blind. Above all, he thought the 70-year-old night nurse was just a tired, slow old man who wouldn't notice a thing. But he made one catastrophic mistake. He didn't know the old man used to analyze enemy movements for Army intelligence. When the digital records lied, the old nurse quietly checked the physical trash and set a trap that brought the DEA swarming into the parking lot at 3 in the morning. Corporate management loved the night shift because there were no witnesses. They liked the predictable quiet. They liked the low overhead. Most of all, they liked that the people working at 3 in the morning were usually too tired to notice the details. They forgot that William Carter was 70 years old, required only 4 hours of sleep a night, and used to analyze enemy movements for Army intelligence. Bill walked the hallway of the Oak Creek Veterans Care Home with a measured, steady step. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, a constant, low-grade mechanical vibration that most people eventually tuned out. Bill didn't tune it out. He tracked it. He tracked the squeak of the ventilation system. He tracked the interval of the security patrols. He tracked everything. He stopped outside room 114. Inside, Elias Vance, a former Marine who had left half his mobility in a jungle 40 years ago, was weeping. It wasn't a loud sound. It was a ragged, exhausted groan pressed into a thin hospital pillow, the sound of a man trying to endure something unendurable. Bill checked his watch. A heavy analog Seiko. The sweeping second hand ticked past the 12. It was 2:15 a.m. He pulled the digital chart on his tablet. The screen glowed cold blue in the dark hallway. According to the corporate electronic record system, Elias had been administered a high dose of liquid morphine at 1:30 a.m. By 2:15, Elias should have been deeply asleep. He should have been floating comfortably above his ruined joints. Instead, he was biting his own hand to keep from waking the veteran in the next bed. Bill stood perfectly still. In a standard care facility, a nurse might assume the patient had built up a tolerance. They might assume the dosage was calculated incorrectly. But Bill Carter had spent 2 decades reading Intercept logs, cross-referencing analog supply manifests, and looking for the lie hidden inside the official report. He knew what an administrative lie looked like, and he knew what untreated pain looked like. Elias wasn't building a tolerance. Elias had been given saline. Bill closed the digital chart. His face remained completely expressionless. He was a weathered man, carved out of patience and old habits. He didn't rush into the room to apologize. He didn't hit the emergency call button to complain to the on-call doctor. Noise was the enemy of investigation. He walked quietly back to the central nursing station. The station was empty. The only other night nurse was on her meal break in the basement. Bill looked at the automated narcotic dispensing cabinet bolted to the wall. It was a state-of-the-art system, installed by the regional manager Julian Cross just 3 months ago. Management claimed it was airtight, completely secure. Every drop accounted for by a digital server. Bill stared at the heavy steel door. He unscrewed the lid of his thermos and poured a cup of black coffee. The electronic record said the drug was dispensed. The patient's agony said it wasn't. There was a gap between the server and the syringe. And in Bill's experience, gaps were exactly where the thieves lived. Bill took a slow sip of his black coffee. The bitter heat grounded him. In military intelligence, you didn't waste time staring at the enemy's official report. You looked for the shadow, the lie cast. He left the nursing station and walked down the darkened corridor toward the administrative wing. Management offices were strictly off-limits to clinical staff during the night shift. The heavy oak door to Julian Cross's office was locked, but Bill had spent 20 years handling logistics and classified materials. A standard commercial tumbler lock was less of a barrier and more of a polite suggestion. He used a physical override key he'd quietly retained from a maintenance drawer his first week on the job. Inside, the office smelled of expensive cologne and corporate ambition. Julian Cross was 35, wore suits that cost a month of Bill's salary, and viewed the elderly veterans down the hall purely as operational expenses. Bill didn't turn on the overhead lights. He used a small, red lens pen light. Red light preserved night vision and didn't bleed under door frames. He ignored the dual-monitor computer setup on the desk. Digital records were Julian's domain. Julian had administrator rights. He could rewrite the server logs from his phone while sitting in traffic. But digital thieves always made the same mistake. They forgot that the physical world still required paper. Bill moved to the wastebasket. He didn't dig randomly. He lifted the bin and carefully tipped the contents onto a plastic mat. Coffee cups, a protein bar wrapper, and a crumpled, blue-tinted piece of paper. Hospital forms were color-coded. Blue meant a manual override sheet for the narcotic cabinet. Bill set his thermos down. He picked up the blue paper and smoothed it out flat against the smooth mahogany surface of Julian's desk, pressing the heavy creases flat with the edge of his hand. It was the manual narcotic count from Tuesday evening. The original document. Bill's red light tracked across the columns. According to this discarded sheet, the evening shift had counted 50 vials of liquid morphine. Both the outgoing and incoming nurses had signed it. But Bill had checked the digital inventory when his shift started. The server claimed the count had been 40 vials since Monday. Julian had stolen 10 vials, altered the digital server to backdate the shortage, and thrown away the physical paper that proved the nurses had counted 50. It was arrogant. And arrogance leaves a trail. Bill looked closer at the bottom of the crumpled page. There was a manager's countersignature in black ink, authorizing a spillage adjustment to explain missing inventory. It was Julian's signature. The timestamp next to it read Tuesday, 11:45 p.m. Bill's eyes narrowed in the red light. Julian Cross hadn't been in the building at 11:45 p.m. on Tuesday. Bill knew that for an absolute fact. He knew because he had watched Julian drive his silver BMW out of the parking lot at exactly 6:30 p.m. A phantom signature. An impossible timestamp. The anomaly was no longer just a suspicion. It was an operation. Bill reached into his scrub pocket and pulled out a small, wire-bound notebook and a cheap ballpoint pen. He didn't touch Julian's keyboard. He didn't try to log into the corporate network. Digital networks logged keystrokes. They tracked IP addresses. But a 70-year-old man writing in a $3 notepad left no trace at all. In the Army, Bill had tracked supply lines through hostile territories. He knew that discovering a stolen crate of ammunition was never the end of the investigation. It was just the thread you pulled. He looked at the blue paper again, writing down the lot numbers in his notebook. If Julian was taking 10 vials a shift, he couldn't just walk out with them. The automated cabinet weighed the inventory. If the physical mass dropped without a corresponding digital patient record, the system would immediately trigger a regional audit. So Julian wasn't just stealing the medication. He was replacing it. Bill clicked his pen. The mechanics of the fraud became terrifyingly clear. Julian was accessing the cabinet during the chaotic shift overlaps. He was taking the morphine vials, using a fine-gauge needle to extract the narcotic through the rubber stopper, and backfilling them with sterile saline. The volume remained identical. The physical weight remained identical. The automated cabinet registered 0 discrepancies. The machine was perfectly secure and completely blind. And because of it, men like Elias Vance were lying in the dark, their ruined bodies burning in unmanaged agony, medicated with nothing but salt water. A cold, heavy anger settled in Bill's chest. It wasn't a loud rage. It was the precise, focused anger of a man who understood the sacred duty of taking care of the wounded. These men had survived jungles, shrapnel, and the brutal passage of time, only to be tortured for a corporate profit margin by a man in a tailored suit. Bill carefully folded the crumpled blue paper into quarters and slipped it into his breast pocket. He picked up the trash bin and meticulously recreated the layer of garbage on top of the desk mat, sliding it all back into the wastebasket exactly as he had found it. He clicked his pen shut and clipped it to his collar. He was just reaching to turn off his red pen light when he heard it. The soft electronic chime of the front lobby doors sliding open. Bill froze. Down the quiet linoleum hallway, a sound echoed. The sharp, deliberate clack of hard-soled leather shoes. It was a fast, aggressive cadence. It was 2:15 inches the morning. Julian Cross had returned. Bill didn't run. Running created noise, and noise created targets. He moved out of Julian's office with the fluid economy of a man who had spent decades mastering the geometry of shadows. He locked the heavy oak door behind him, leaving no trace of the override key, and stepped back into the sterile glow of the hallway. He was standing near the central nursing station, pouring the last drops of his coffee into the thermos cap, when Julian Cross rounded the corner. Julian was wearing a dark overcoat, his jaw tight, his eyes moving with the restless energy of a man managing too many moving pieces. He stopped when he saw Bill, his gaze flicked to the coffee. to Bill's face, and then down the hallway toward his own office. "Carter," Julian said. His voice was sharp, too loud for a facility full of sleeping patients. "What are you doing standing around?" "Just taking a coffee break, Mr. Cross," Bill said. He let his shoulders slump slightly. He softened his voice, adding a slight tremor that wasn't normally there, playing perfectly into the stereotype Julian expected. A tired, slow, obsolete old man. "It's been a quiet night," Julian sneered, a brief, ugly expression of corporate contempt. "It's about to get busier. I'm conducting a surprise operational audit." Bill took a slow sip from his thermos cap. The folded blue paper rested heavy against his chest inside his scrub pocket. "At 2 in the morning, sir? The regional board requires unannounced compliance checks," Julian snapped, pulling out his phone. His eyes darted toward the automated narcotic cabinet on the wall behind Bill. "You clinical staff get too comfortable on the night shift. Mistakes get made. Inventories get sloppy." Bill looked at Julian's expensive leather shoes. He thought about Elias Vance whimpering in room 114. He kept his face blank. "Of course, Mr. Cross. Let me know if you need me to pull any patient files." "I don't need you to pull anything," Julian said, stepping closer. He looked at Bill with a sudden narrow suspicion. "Actually, Carter, I need you to step away from the station. Go check the south wing." "The south wing is stable, sir." "Do it anyway," Julian ordered. He turned his back to Bill and marched directly to the automated cabinet. "I'm locking down the dispensing server for an emergency software patch. No access until I clear it. If a patient complains, give them Tylenol." Bill stood perfectly still. "A software patch. At 2:30 a.m. Julian wasn't here to audit. He was here to purge the server logs before the morning shift arrived. He was going to wipe the digital trail of his phantom signature. Bill didn't argue. He knew that arguing with a man holding administrative access only accelerated the conflict before the battlefield was fully prepared. He turned and walked toward the south wing. He was halfway down the corridor when the alarm hit. Beep, beep, beep. It was a rapid, piercing sound, a critical cardiac monitor alarm echoing from room 118. Bill moved. He dropped the slow, heavy shuffle he'd performed for Julian and shifted into the efficient, ground-eating stride of a man who had spent his youth running toward gunfire. He pushed through the heavy wooden door of the patient's room. The elderly veteran inside was fast asleep, snoring softly. Bill checked the patient first, skin warm, respiration steady, chest rising and falling in a slow, natural rhythm. Then, he looked up at the monitor on the wall. It was flashing a bright, urgent red. Bill stepped closer and checked the parameters. The high heart rate threshold had been manually lowered from 120 beats per minute to 60. The machine was alarming because someone had deliberately programmed it to fail. "Sloppy, Carter." Bill turned. Julian Cross was standing in the doorway, his arms crossed over his tailored suit, holding a digital tablet in his hand. "A critical cardiac event, and you were wandering the halls," Julian said. His voice was smooth, dripping with manufactured disappointment. "The server shows you haven't logged a vitals check in this room for 4 hours. That's a severe protocol violation. Patient d'engagement." Bill looked at the monitor, and then at Julian. Julian had altered the logs when he locked down the dispensing cabinet. He was fabricating a paper trail of negligence, a fake incident to justify an immediate termination. "The patient is stable, Mr. Cross," Bill said. His voice was perfectly even. Julian stepped further into the room. He expected Bill to stammer. He expected the old man to panic, to worry about losing his license, to beg for his job. But Bill didn't do any of those things. He just watched Julian. His eyes were entirely still, analyzing the corporate manager not as an authority figure, but as a hostile variable. There was absolutely no fear in the old man's gaze. Julian's posture stiffened. A cold prickle of paranoia crawled up his spine. He didn't know what Bill knew, but the absolute lack of panic unsettled him deeply. "You're a liability to this facility," Julian snapped, the smooth corporate facade cracking for a fraction of a second. "I'm not waiting for morning. In my office. Right now." Julian sat behind his heavy mahogany desk. He didn't offer Bill a chair. "I have zero tolerance for negligence," Julian said, leaning forward. He was playing the part of the strict administrator, but his eyes were too wide, his breathing slightly too fast, sleeping on shift, failing to log vitals. "I'm terminating your employment, Carter, effective immediately." Hand over your badge. Bill didn't argue. He reached up, unclipped his plastic ID badge from his scrub collar, and tossed it onto the desk. It landed on the polished wood with a hollow Times clack. Bill looked at the badge, then looked at Julian. In intelligence work, an enemy's timeline always revealed their objective. Why fire a night nurse at 2:45 inches the morning? Why not wait until the shift change at 7 a.m. when HR was in the building? Because Julian didn't just want Bill fired. He wanted Bill out of the building times right now. Bill's mind moved with the cold, frictionless speed of a man mapping a battlefield. Julian had locked down the automated server to wipe the digital logs. He had fired the only nurse on the floor who paid attention. Why? What was happening in the next 30 minutes that required absolute privacy? Then, Bill remembered the facility's logistical schedule. Thursday mornings. 3:15 a.m. The biohazard and medical waste disposal truck. Julian wasn't just covering his digital tracks. The stolen morphine vials, the ones Julian had emptied and replaced with saline, were still in the building. He needed to smuggle the real narcotics out or dispose of the tamper-evident seals before the morning shift arrived. The disposal truck was his blind transport. If Bill was forced out of the building now, the physical evidence would leave with the truck, and Julian's digital wipe would make the crime invisible forever. Bill felt the folded blue paper resting in his breast pocket. He had the manual log. But without the physical vials, a corporate lawyer would argue the paper was a simple accounting error. He needed the physical chain of custody. He needed to spring the trap before the truck arrived. "I understand, Mr. Cross," Bill said. He let his voice crack just a fraction. He looked down at the floor, playing the defeated, exhausted old man to absolute perfection. "I'm sorry. I guess I'm just getting too old for the night shift." Julian exhaled, a sharp breath of relief. The old man was rolling over. "Security will escort you out. I just need 10 minutes to clear my locker," Bill said quietly. "My arthritis medication is in there. I won't cause any trouble." Julian glanced at his watch. 2:50 a.m. 10 minutes, Carter. Not 1 minute more. The locker room was in the basement, a windowless concrete box that smelled of bleach and damp towels. Bill didn't open his locker. He didn't have arthritis medication. He pulled out his notebook, flipped to the back page, and checked his heavy analog watch. 2:51 a.m. The sweeping second hand ticked relentlessly. He had exactly 9 minutes before building security came down to escort him to the parking lot. If he called the local police, it would take 20 minutes to dispatch a cruiser. When they arrived, Julian would meet them at the door, flash his corporate credentials, and explain that a disgruntled, senile employee was making false accusations. The local cops wouldn't know the difference between a narcotic cabinet server log and a microwave manual. Julian would walk. Bill didn't need local cops. He needed federal authority. He pulled his personal cell phone from his pocket. It wasn't a smartphone. It was an older, durable model, untraceable by corporate Wi-Fi. He punched in a 10-digit number he had written in his notebook 3 years ago. It rang twice. OIG, DEA, Regional Duty Desk, Agent Miller. The voice was sharp, professional, and wide awake. "Miller, this is William Carter, former chief analyst, CID Logistics." Bill's voice was no longer that of a tired old nurse. It was crisp, authoritative, carrying the undeniable weight of command. "I need an immediate intercept at the Oak Creek Veterans Care Home loading dock." A pause on the other end. "Mr. Carter, it's been a while. What's the situation?" "Schedule 2 narcotic diversion." "Large scale," Bill said. "The facility manager is swapping liquid morphine with saline. He just locked down the server to wipe the digital footprint. He's moving the physical product out on the biohazard disposal truck in approximately 7 the way dwell. That truck leaves the dock, the physical chain of custody is broken. You have evidence?" "I have the original manual sign-out log with his forged timestamp, retrieved from his wastebasket," Bill said, "and I have the exact inventory discrepancy mapped. I need federal jurisdiction on site right now to halt that truck and seize the cabinet." "Oak Creek is 4 miles from the regional field office," Miller said. The sound of a chair scraping back echoed through the phone. "I have a night shift tactical unit in the area. We can be there in 6 minutes." "Make it 5, Bill said. "I'm being forcibly removed from the building." He hung up. Above him, on the ground floor, He heard the heavy diesel rumble of a truck pulling into the loading dock. The backup alarm beeped times beep, beep, beep times, cutting through the quiet night. Then came the heavy knock on the locker room door. "Carter?" The security guard's voice echoed through the concrete. "10 minutes are up. Let's go." The night air was cold on the loading dock. The security guard walked half a step behind Bill, guiding him toward the employee parking lot. But Bill didn't walk toward his aging sedan. He adjusted his trajectory, his steps steady and deliberate, moving directly toward the idling biohazard disposal truck. Julian Cross was standing at the edge of the dock, handing a heavy, red-sealed plastic tote to the truck driver. "Just this one tonight," Julian was saying over the rumble of the diesel engine. "Special disposal protocol." "Put the box down, Mr. Cross," Bill said. His voice cut through the mechanical noise of the truck. It wasn't loud, but it carried the absolute, unyielding authority of a man accustomed to giving orders in war zones. Julian spun around. The arrogant smirk on his face tightened into genuine anger. "I told you to escort him off the property," he barked at the security guard. The guard reached for Bill's arm, but Bill didn't even look at him. He just kept walking forward until he was standing 3 feet from Julian. "You wiped the dispensing server at 2:38 a.m., Bill said. His eyes were locked on Julian's face. "You altered the cardiac monitor in room 118 at 2:42 a.m. to create a pretext for termination. It was a clean tactical sequence, digitally perfect." Julian stared at him. The confidence was suddenly gone from the administrator's eyes, replaced by the rapid, frantic calculations of a cornered animal. "You're a senile old man. Get off my property." Bill reached into his scrub pocket. He pulled out the blue manual sign-out log, carefully unfolded it, and held it up in the harsh yellow light of the loading dock. "But you threw the manual log in your wastebasket," Bill said, "with your countersignature, dated 11:45 p.m. When you weren't even in the building." Julian saw the blue paper. He lunged for it. Before he could cross the 3 feet between them, the loading dock was flooded with blinding white light. Tires screeched on the asphalt as 2 black SUVs swerved into the parking lot, aggressively boxing in the disposal truck. The doors flew open. 4 federal agents stepped out, wearing tactical vests with Times DEA, Times printed in bold yellow letters across the back. Agent Miller, a tall man with a severe face, walked directly up the dock ramp. "William," Miller said, nodding to Bill. "Agent Miller," Bill replied. He handed the blue paper to the federal agent, then pointed at the red plastic tote in Julian's hands. "There's your missing liquid morphine. I suggest you check the tamper seals." Julian dropped the box. It hit the concrete with a heavy thud. He looked at the DEA agents, then at the blue piece of paper, and finally at the 70-year-old nurse he had thought was a fool. The metallic click of handcuffs snapping around Julian Cross's wrists was the loudest sound on the dock. The fallout was swift, structural, and completely devastating to corporate management. By 6 a.m., the Oak Creek Veterans Care Home was swarming with federal investigators. The digital dispensing server was seized. The red plastic tote was opened on the loading dock, revealing 50 vials of sterile saline wrapped in falsified tamper-evident tape. Julian Cross was placed in the back of a federal vehicle. He didn't have the leverage to make a deal. The physical chain of custody Bill had secured was airtight. Julian would eventually face 22 counts of federal drug diversion, fraud, and elder abuse. But Bill Carter didn't care about the courtroom. He cared about room 114. At 6:30 a.m., under direct DEA supervision, emergency replacement narcotics were brought into the facility. A state-appointed physician authorized a new dose for Elias Vance. Bill administered it himself. He stood by the bedside and watched the medication take effect. It didn't happen instantly, but slowly, the rigid tension began to drain from the old Marine's shoulders. The ragged, shallow breath smoothed out into a deep, steady rhythm. For the first time in 3 days, Elias Vance slept without pain. His face, weathered by time and suffering, finally looked at peace. Bill pulled the blanket up over the veteran's shoulders. He stepped out of the room, closing the door quietly behind him. At 7 a.m., the morning shift arrived, standing in shocked clusters in the lobby as federal agents moved through the administrative wing. Agent Miller found Bill in the break room. Bill was unscrewing his thermos, pouring one final cup of black coffee. Outside the window, the sun was just beginning to break over the horizon, washing the parking lot in pale, cold gold. The corporate office is in a state of absolute panic, Miller said, leaning against the doorframe. They're asking the Department of Health to recommend an independent compliance monitor to oversee their entire regional network. You want the job, William? It pays triple. Corner office. Day shift. Bill looked out the window. He thought about the corner office. He thought about the daylight. Then he thought about the absolute, necessary quiet of the night shift and the vulnerable men who lived inside it. No thank you, Miller, Bill said quietly. I already have a job. He took a slow sip of the bitter coffee. People look at the elderly and see the past. They see frailty, slow steps, and quiet voices. They assume that an old man walking the halls at 3 in the morning is just running out the clock. They forget that the quiet ones have spent a lifetime learning exactly how to watch. They forget that these old men were once young men who went to war, who learned the hard way how to protect the people standing next to them. And sometimes, the most dangerous mistake an arrogant man can make is assuming that a silent watcher is a blind one. Bill Carter checked his heavy analog watch. The sweeping second hand ticked past the 12. His shift was over. He would be back tomorrow night.